Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show, where we bring you interesting guests that can help us understand what to do with our money, how to grow our business, and how to improve ourselves. And today we have a special guest. We have the CEO of Circuit City, Ronny Shmoel, with us. Hey, Ronny, welcome to the show.
Hey, Axel, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I really look forward to having the opportunity to talk to you. And before we go into a little bit, what you're doing these days, can you tell the audience a little bit, how did you actually get to the role and the position that you have these days?
Absolutely. It was a long road. So I started out at a very young age, really wanting to succeed in business. I had that entrepreneurship spirit, as I say, as I also watched peers around me. I've seen, my father, my uncles, hardworking, earning their money, building lives and families for themselves. And I noticed this at a very young age. And I said to myself, my father really came to the country. He's from Israel, came to the country by himself, no family, no money. And he built himself up from scratch. I missed a lot of time with him. And this feeds into where I am today in life. He was working 7 days a week. As a growing boy, 5, 6, 7, I wanted time with my dad. I wanted to play ball like some of my other neighbors where I grew up in New York. And I said to myself, one of my goals is building myself up and having really the freedom to stay home one day from business or whatever I would be doing when I get older, to not miss a recital or a basketball game. And to date, I've been really staying close to that, with family, I have a little 11-year-old girl. When she asks me to be at a recital or, she's very creative and into a lot of things, after school curricular activities, I make it my business, no matter what I'm doing, to give that attention. And there's something about that. So just wanted to put that out there, how important family, the blend. And if you have to be somewhere in business, it happens. Okay. So I started out, my dad, I would say the course of his tenure in his professional career went into business. Really had very little high school degree at that point. Didn't go to college at that time era in the 70s. And at the point of his success, it's kind of almost direct into mine and blending in together. He opened up a very successful chain of consumer electronics stores. Through that, I've watched him day one all the way till he sold his business successfully. And I worked with him for a little bit through college. Just wanted to earn money like everybody else in college. I ended up learning a very valuable aspect, I would say, in my skill set, and it was sales. The number one thing I could tell anybody and everybody: learn how to sell. And it doesn't matter what you learn, and sell it in a clean way where you deliver a solution to the customer. And that's really one of the things that drove me into business, commerce, where I am today. And it was I almost got a natural high from selling something to somebody that they needed or wanted. And as I evolved, the business that I didn't want to be was in retail, brick and mortar. In college, and there was nothing wrong with it. I think at the time, it was really the only way at the cusp between, there was mail order catalogs, Axel, and there were retail brick and mortars. And many retailers were overbuilding hundreds into the thousands of retail stores. But then there's something magical that happened, which is called e-commerce. Amazon, early, mid 90s, started climbing, and I noticed that. Through that, I noticed how the transformation, would take, how people would adapt. And I was fascinated by computer science and e-commerce. It's just really like technology today, and where we see where things are going. That's really the time era. A lot of .coms were opening, a lot of were closing. I really stuck to my thesis, where I thought I can take the successes from what my dad did in retail in his category, which was consumer electronics. So I was like a consumer electronics baby at this point. Seeing the Circuit Cities at their heights, the Best Buys coming in, inching up, and everybody else in between. So Circuit City and Best Buy, the two, like Coke and Pepsi effect, right? In the late 90s, there was a brand in New York called 47 Street Photo. Number one, probably the number one or two consumer electronic retailer in the state, regionally, $800 million in revenue. They went bankrupt for various reasons, nothing to really talk about. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, if we renamed your stores 47 Street Photo, what would that do to the bottom line? And at first he was a little hesitant. I said, you know what? Well, I'm going to take all the money I earned and I'm going to borrow some and I'm going to acquire this brand. And I did. My dad ended up working with me for a little bit after that, but I ended up building up that brand to being one of the top 500 e-commerce companies. I also, in that interim, had a parallel to that, or before 47, I had two other e-commerce companies that focused on computing, business solutions, digital cameras when they were like the thing, right, to talk about. And I ended up exiting through four other businesses in totality up to today's date. So I accumulated earnings, wealth, equity. I ended up investing the equity that I earned through these businesses into real estate, which was more risk adverse, more solid, though I'd noticed that my returns weren't always as great as businesses. So I didn't want to stop there. Within the time of 47th Street, I had the opportunity of being in the industry and acquiring the brand Circuit City, which was something, again, magical that happened to me. It was like I won the lottery. If you're in the industry and you understand consumer electronics and e-commerce and where it's going, having a brand with the power of the caliber of Circuit City, which is almost like a household name. We did research, we did polls, focus groups, and really everything pointed in the right direction for us. So I launched Circuit City in 2018, soft launched it, and we've been very successful, I would say. We invested our own capital. Think of a private equity family office investment to date, and it's been a really great ride.
Yeah, absolutely. Congrats on that. Just for the audience, I mean, for me, Circuit City was a household name. It's kind of like you mentioned, like Lowe's and Home Depot or Apple and Samsung and so forth. There are kind of like these dualities. Those names, like if you have a certain age or if you grew up in a certain time, like you said, were household names. What would you say is the distinction that the brand is doing now? I mean, you mentioned e-commerce, but can you encapsulate that a little bit more?
So what I've learned was this asset class, at the same time, of intellectual property is its own category class of assets. And it's almost has gotten too hot. Over the past, I'd say 15 to 20 years, roughly, there has been a resurgence of immense capital being poured into brands. Toys R Us made a relaunch, and there's a reason private equity groups and investors are getting into this. If you have a siloed business, an e-commerce business or a technology company that's a blend of a marketplace technology, it's almost at its own island, right, as a business. But if you couple it with a brand, it's just that much more powerful, right? Because what I found was relaunching a brand like this, it's not about what the brand was, it's where people are today and where they're going. So you have to almost craft it in a way where it meant something to a lot of people, which is the brand awareness. There's a connection, there's a nostalgic component to this, but you have to learn from the failures and you have to see where the successes were in some capacity. But the business model is totally different. So again, I designed with my team, who we hand selected from the consumer electronic industry. There are some people from Amazon, really the right companies that have the experience to help us drive growth and milestones. But the business, again, is designed as an e-commerce technology company first, a platform, you can call it. And then we position it with a brand, overlaying it with Circuit City. So it's a really good way to go to market, as our marketing cost is a lot less than you can imagine. Because again, if you see the brand Circuit City online, or you see John's Electronics, never heard of John's Electronics, you're going to gravitate towards a brand We've done studies that
you mentioned, when a company goes out of business, they oftentimes also either don't mind or don't care, or whatever you want to call it, that what happens to their original name. And what I hear you saying is, well, but there is value in the recognition of that name, even if the original business as a brick and mortar business, for example, doesn't exist anymore. So part of my question goes a little bit in the direction of, how far away from the category that that business is known for can you go without losing the benefits?
Okay, that's a great question. So Circuit City at its height, revenue was at 12 to 15 billion. Public company, outperformed many S&P 500. Circuit City was in a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. Read the book, loved it. The capacity of where we can go, I would say, is infinite in this category. It all depends on how far I want to drive it, how big we want to make it. And if, looking back at Circuit City and how big they were, I have great expectations, especially what we've done over the last 5 years with our traction. Again, very little marketing. I could tell you that it's probably in the 1 to 2 percentile of spend versus revenue, which is it's going to go up. I mean, it should go up as we scale and bring more revenue. But building the foundation of a solid business comes first, right? That's really what I always do when I develop and I create with my team. You got to create the solid business and then have that asset on top of it. So God forbid if something ever happened.
The reason I was so excited to have you come on, because I obviously knew a little bit about the backstory, is that the way I would, in my own words, describe it, and maybe tell me if you think this is a fair description, is that through your upbringing, you already had some passion for that kind of industry, and then later had the opportunity to combine it with a well-known brand name. If somebody is out there and asks him or herself, okay, what would if I had the free choice to start a business, what kind of area, what kind of industry, what kind of thing that I'm passionate about would that business be in? And I think the educational component of our conversation today is to say, okay, well, if you identify that, then it might be worth your time to go out and look at what names, brand names for that matter,
Yes.
are out there that people might already know, rather than you having to come up with something and then explain constantly what this name that you came up with actually means, versus maybe finding something that has a history that people, certain age groups, can start recognizing. And maybe even, I don't know if you would agree to that or if that's your experience, but I feel, maybe this is part of when you get older, I feel it's actually kind of cool that some of these brands that, I kind of grew up with, or I saw them when I went to college or stuff like that, and was a little sad, like Toys R Us is one of those things, right? Like I know that my wife and I went into Toys R Us stores quite a bit when our daughter was little, just amazed at how much stuff for kids could exist, like in a Walmart size store or something like that, and really felt a little sad, even though we weren't in some way affected, right? Our daughter grew out of that age and it wasn't really a big deal anymore, but still there is a little feeling of sadness when something that you had an experience with is going away. A certain feeling of joy when you hear that there are the Ronnys and others in the world who actually say, yeah, maybe it's not suited for what it was originally made for, but it's still suited either for its category or for something adjacent to its category. So that's, I think, part of the message today is to say, hey, it might be worth taking a look in the category that you want to start your business in to see what kind of brands and brand names are out there, and they have some name recognition.
Something, Toys R Us relaunched. There's a private equity group that got together, acquired the brand amongst a few other brands too in different categories. And Toys R Us is relaunched, but in a different iteration. They licensed out the brand in the US to Macy's now. So there's a whole collaboration aspect.
I'm always looking for, how can our audience, who is mainly consisting of people who are looking for investing opportunities, and I think investing into the brand name so that your business can get recognition sooner rather than later is a form of investing, even though it's not buying a building or something like that necessarily. Now, the other thing I have to ask you, because you're an expert in that industry, I'm kind of wondering the same thing as well. With the advent of e-commerce, and maybe this is another one of those, like I age myself kind of things, but I still like to actually be able to touch it, to see it, to see how it feels, to, like how solid it is or not solid it is, how responsive it is, depending on what kind of an item you're talking about. Where do you see that going into in a world where everything is becoming more and more online? What do you foresee is going to happen when I
Question.
say, okay, I'm ready for my next fill in the blank consumer electronics item, and there might not be really stores in the traditional sense anymore? What will happen then, or how do we actually handle that?
No, only because I studied this for a long time. I got to tell all entrepreneurs this who are listening, it doesn't matter again, it's the surface comment. It does not matter what you're selling. It doesn't matter. I've gone into other categories, apparel, pet supplies, home, decor, online before. And not to sound like that, but I have. And you know, if you apply the same business 101 e-commerce rules, they generally apply. Now, let me go down one more layer. They're going to differ. The merchandising is going to differ. Association is going to differ. How you display the product is going to differ in that category. How the consumer sees it, how they connect with the item. It can be eyeglasses. Now you can go on and you can have a VR eyeglass. You look in the camera and I can see how my sunglasses will look on me. Great. Now it's not exactly one-to-one as if you would go to a store, a Sunglass Hut, or wherever, or Warby Parker, and actually put on a pair of glasses. There's some things that I personally like going to retail too. Don't get me wrong, but as I've seen the industry from 2009 all the way to COVID. COVID accelerated. My parents, people that are in the millennial, Gen X, baby boomers, we kind of all had to adapt in COVID and had to really push ourselves to buy groceries or wherever we have to do online. But then there's a big gap, and I'm going to go back to your question. There's a huge gap still online, physical, and the digital world, commerce. There are new tools out there that are coming. They're not widely presented. They're not widely on e-commerce websites. It's Shopify. Okay. A lot of the new digital technologies that allow consumers to interact with the product differently are just kind of like almost out of the box at Shopify. And I speak to Shopify corporate just because I'm not on their platform. We have our own larger platform, but they're doing great things for that category. Now, what I learned is create as much as you can digital experiences for the consumer. I'll tell you what we just betaed. We just betaed a shop by room feature where think about your kitchen, think about your living room, and seeing a soundbar, a TV in this virtual room. Now, what's cool about it is you can swap out a different size TV. You can phase two of it. You can actually point a Circuit City app to your room, and it'll actually take the measurements of your room. And you can see, oh, this TV is too big for me. And then you can do it in the kitchen. You can see different color appliances. What we're trying to do is really bring the fusion between digital and retail to as close. Now, I'm going to go into the next level. We're not there yet. It's the metaverse. I don't have to spend too much time.
I always tell the story about my first desktop computer that I spent $3,000 on, and it had the enormous ability of 11 megabytes of capability, right?
Exactly.
When Napster came around, my daughter and I mean, those are fond memories, but we went literally into the office. She and I looked at the list of songs in Napster, and we picked two or three, hoping that one of them would make it through the night so we could play and listen to it the next morning, right? Like with acoustic dial-up modem. So what I was getting on a little bit is that textile experience, right? Even with the VR environment, whether it's Apple or the Meta goggles or anything like that, it is still a visual, very visual, obviously. And when done well, I think it can do some of its benefit. But I was wondering, when people are successful in business, and which is basically who we are catering to, I always say, you know, we're helping employees and business owners to get to financial independence. What's your experience? You mentioned earlier that you did some investing in real estate, and obviously for a rocket ship business, it can compete, but real estate, on the other hand, can be a very anchoring for like as a reserve and as a longevity type of thing. People that are building businesses, to what extent should they basically take part of their profits? How much would you suggest they should relatively early start putting aside to build basically this reserve foundation?
That's a great question. I'm going to answer that directly. I would say an estimation of their profits. It depends if they're a proprietary owner. They may have more flexibility if they have partners. Yeah. It all depends. on what they want to do. If they want passive income, I can tell you that there were certain times in my prior business that I did not, I just kept on recapitalizing in my business because I knew that the returns just from experience would be that much greater than putting it into a multifamily, putting it into, even if I was getting dividends, how much of the dividend versus I wait 3 more years and then sell a business? You can't equate that. But I would say a healthy range is 10 to 15% of profit into real estate. Just me. You know what? We were all ingrained and dwelled to think as real estate as being investment. But as I learned being an entrepreneur, businesses are really where you make the multiples, really the big multiples. And I think from my vertical of real estate, I've stuck to multifamily. Multifamilies are always really good. Multi-tenant, which means that if I'm in, I buy a home that I have 6 units in, you kind of have that rent roll. If one comes, it's really good if you want to invest in that and you don't have to deal with the tenants. That's another story, right? It all depends on what aspect. And another really hot vertical that people are now, in a good way, kind of finding and figuring out is industrial warehousing. That's really what I invested capital in over the past 15 years or so. Because as e-commerce was going, it's supporting that industry of warehousing.
Right. No, I was actually thinking you were from an industrial category go into like data centers or stuff like that, because obviously your platform or your business has to run on something, right? And it's basically an e-commerce platform. I don't know if it runs on AWS or something similar, but it runs on something like that, right? And I'm with you that the reason that we are basically and for smaller businesses than Circuit City pushing in that direction is because it has both the investing component, and I always preach quite heavily that it also has that social component, right? And in some cases, just earlier today, I was mentioning to somebody who spoke to me about it, that even larger scale businesses like Google and Tesla and Microsoft and so forth are now realizing that if they want to keep their talent relatively close to where their main operations are, especially when it comes to the creative and innovative part of operations, like the engineering of new products or services and stuff, then the places like Seattle or anywhere in the Bay Area or stuff like that, Silicon Valley, have gotten so outlandishly expensive that it actually starts making sense for the companies to say, well, maybe we should actually invest in developing some real estate for our people, right? So that they can actually be closer to where we are operating without having to pay so much of the salary that we're paying them, that the next opportunity they get from somebody who either allows them to work from home or is in a much less expensive area can just snag them away from us because of that and not because of what actually our mission or vision is, right? And so that's this what I believe is a social component of an investor like you and me investing in real estate, to providing shelter to people who want to have a nice place to live for a fair price.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to watch the trends and seeing where people are moving. Tesla, believe they built their HQ in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, exactly. And they bought huge tracts of land, and some people are speculating that some of that will be company housing, basically, like built like a little Tesla town or something like that.
No, and by the way, that probably is the future for big corporations. You need to make your personnel and people comfortable, and there's a lot of opportunity out there too. It doesn't have to be in the metro cities, or you go out further, you go out and over. Real estate is a long-term game, I think. You just have to sit. You got to wait.
It's sometimes hard to have the patience, but that's what I'm also telling people. In the real estate game, 5 years is basically nothing, right? Like, so you have to So Ronny, if people were inspired by you basically reviving that brand for Circuit City and having experience with that, how can they get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So we recently launched a Series A that's open to accredited investors, and we waited to open up this round because we really wanted to demonstrate the traction at the end of the day. Our revenues are exceedingly over 130 million today over the lifetime of our launch. If people would like to reach us, they can reach us a few different ways really quick. They can reach us through invest.circuitcity.com, and they can also reach us through investor.relations@circuitcity.com. And anybody ever wants to shout out a comment or trade or share an idea with me, they can reach me through LinkedIn, Ronny Shmoel. and they'll find me Circuit City. I mean, I'm open to it, of course.
Right, exactly. And all that, what you just mentioned, the links and the email address and stuff, the LinkedIn link, we're going to put that in the show notes. So anybody who is interested can go and find you and find your team and get in touch with you.
Sure.
With that all being said, as you know, we always have these two questions at the end of the show that are not really related to the investing or the business itself. And the first one is, if you could meet anybody, who would it be and why?
Somebody that I've always wanted to meet was Steve Jobs. He's not alive anymore. And there are various common reasons why, because of his imagination, because of his innovation, how we look at the world today in technology, right? That's just one thing. Today, if I could meet a peer and pick his brain, I mean, it would be the obvious of the two. So in my humble experience, in this industry, I would want to meet Jeff Bezos, just kind of really go in, get really deep with him. Again, his vision for Amazon from the early days and his inspiration and how he got there, that would really make me happy.
Okay, yeah, those are cool folks. And if you do that somehow through some magic trick or something like that,
yeah,
Steve Jobs, what he really meant by the thing in the universe. I've heard it.
Yeah, no, he definitely left a legacy and an impact. And we'll be talking about Steve Jobs for the next millennial.
So the other question, and I know you've been itching to answer that one, is if you had a time machine, Ronny, where would you go and why?
It's such a question without just like answering, I want to live in, the Renaissance times. Where do I want to be? It's really a question of like almost, where do I envision my life? Where would I want to dwell? Where would I want to be? And I put some thought into this last night and this morning. Would want to live in a time era in the future. And I say that just because of where technology is today and where it's going and where it can be. Artificial intelligence, AI, right? I mean, what's that going to do to our lives? Our daily tasks, our daily lives, AI-powered assistant, robots. Just envisioning a future in 20 to 40 years. So it'd be 20 years from now, we see the reemergence of some of the technologies that were placed 10, 15 years ago, but they're actually coming to fruition now. You have Boston Robotics, you have so many new ones popping up, and I'm excited for that. I mean, I think that it could definitely change our lives, especially in, the medical world, right? Healthcare, curable diseases, life extension technologies, years to come. Also, a topic is renewable energy, right? So I'm very passionate about climate change. I live in New York and I've seen, we've had really warm winters. I mean, there's a reason. So I don't want to talk about that political aspect of it, but I think, having renewable energy will help us. Also, transportation is dramatically changing. And it all comes from the energy, the AI technologies in 20 years from now. California, I think by 2030 now, you cannot buy a new car if it's not electric. And then there's a whole thing about electric cars, which...
So are you thinking about 20 years in the future? Is that kind of where you
20 years in the future, yeah. I also hope to have grow the family and expand. So I kind of like...
Well, I'm kind of curious about that too. Part of what I'm actually started to contemplate every so often here and there, especially when I have the chance to talk to great guests like you on podcasts. Afterwards, I'm asking myself, how do we as a society or even as individuals will live and handle the fact that all the things that we, at least in my life, I've basically been taught, part of the big purpose is to contribute, right? I wonder really, and I want our audience maybe to close on that, to wonder a little bit, how would life be different if your personal contribution is no longer as necessary? I don't want to say at all necessary, but as necessary for the overall survival of like communities as it is and has been for hundreds of years. If there is like robo-taxis and everybody has an Optimus who cleans and washes and does everything, and the worst, at least medical things can be cured without probably even having a doctor. You just get a diagnosis from your Optimus and then sends you somewhere, and it's all basically mechanized, so to speak. And production is cheap because, people don't have to go for 8 hours to work anymore and all those kind of things. I'm wondering a little bit, how is life when the personal contribution can be reduced to a minimum? And that's an interesting question to explore. And maybe it's one that you and I can explore at another episode. So
it's really great to leave off on that. I've kind of thought about what do we do with our time when things are automated and things. And I think there's a shift, right? In society and time. Do we spend more time in building our society culturally, spending more time with family if we can, a little leisure, right? So I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
I hear you. And to me, how would I use time, or is the term using time in and of itself even appropriate, right? Because there's always this like using it in a useful way or in a wasteful way. Can you just be alive and self-fulfilled and then kind of start filling in what that could mean? So there's a lot there that could be found and could be explored.
No, I don't have the answer also, but I think there's one thing that I've learned from different cultures. If we have a purpose, and I don't know what that means, that can mean many different things. If we have a purpose in good, wherever that will take us, I think that could be a good starting point. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And I want to thank you, Ronny, for being with us and to share some thoughts, and again congratulate you for everything that you've done with Circuit City. So maybe we can do it again.
Axel, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed being on your show, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.